When Nate Calloway came home from war, the last thing he expected to inherit was a rotting mountain cabin everyone in Black Hollow said was worthless. But the first night inside, Cody, the 4-year-old Belgian Malinois who had survived deployment beside him, went still at the kitchen stove and started listening to the floor like another soldier was breathing below it. Minutes later, strange headlights climbed the ridge. Masked men circled the house, and Nate discovered a hidden hatch leading into an old military tunnel system no one in town was supposed to know existed. By dawn, he understood the cabin was never abandoned. His father's death was never an accident, and the sheriff smiling in town already knew too much. Under that mountain, something had been waiting for him. What time are you watching from? Please like, share, and subscribe to K9 and Seal Stories. And now the story begins. Nate Calloway had been home for 6 days when the attorney from Lexington finally reached him and said the will had cleared. He almost let the phone ring out because unknown numbers usually meant forms, sympathy, or somebody trying to drag him back into a version of himself he had worked very hard to survive. But the woman was patient, precise, and dry enough to hold his attention. Her name was Cecilia Boone. She told him that Daniel Calloway, deceased, had left him 1 parcel in Black Hollow County, 47 wooded acres, 1 condemned mountain cabin, and every mineral, access, and subsurface right attached to the land. Nate said he had not spoken to his father in 14 years. Cecilia replied that the dead were often more decisive than the living, and gave him the courthouse file number before hanging up. 2 mornings later, with nothing else in Kentucky that felt more unfinished than that sentence, Nate loaded Cody into the truck and headed east under a lid of cold rain. Black Hollow sat in a fold of mountain land, like a place that had once expected prosperity and then learned how to live without it. The gas station sold live bait beside chewing tobacco. The diner windows were fogged from old coffee and fryer oil. The church still held its paint because people kept painting it, not because the weather had spared it. Nate rolled slowly past the courthouse square and felt eyes turn toward the truck. Men in clean field jackets and women with grocery bags looked at his digital camouflage first, then at Cody, who stared back through the passenger window with stillness so focused it made curiosity turn into caution. At the county clerk counter, a young woman with a county badge and wind-burned cheeks introduced herself as Mara Jensen and slid a paper packet toward him. She said the cabin had no active electric account, no road maintenance agreement, and a standing access dispute through state forest land. She also said Daniel Calloway had paid taxes in cash and never asked favors. The way she said it made that sound like a kind of local holiness. Before Nate could ask more, Sheriff Wade Rourke appeared in the office doorway with the heavy, practiced ease of a man used to entering rooms he did not need permission to enter. He was broad through the shoulders, older than Nate's father had been when Nate last saw him, and smiling in a way that never changed his eyes. He welcomed Nate home, shook his hand 1 beat too long, and said the road to the cabin had washed out in places. Then he added that there was nothing up there worth hurting himself over. Nate thanked him, took the brass key wrapped in yellowed masking tape, and left with the packet under one arm, and Cody moving at heel. Mara watched him go with an expression that was not friendliness exactly, but something close to concern. The mountain road narrowed from patched county blacktop to mud, then from mud to old ruts and loose stone. By the time the truck climbed the last switchback, the sky had started closing into the deep slate color that comes just before hard evening. The cabin stood where Nate dimly remembered it, resting against exposed limestone on one side and hanging over a pine-heavy drop on the other. It was smaller than memory and more stubborn than ruin. The porch sagged, but not fatally. The windows were filmed with dust, but not broken. The place smelled of wet timber, old smoke, iron, and stone. Nate stood in the yard for a full minute before moving. He had been there once as a boy. Daniel had made him learn how to count exits without turning his head, how to listen before touching a door, and how to look for new tire cuts in wet ground. Back then it had felt like one of his father's mean little lessons. Standing in the rain now, Nate felt those instructions return with the shape of warning. Cody circled the cabin once, nose working, gait controlled, ears pivoting to details Nate could not hear. When the dog came back to Nate's side without the relaxed softness of an all-clear, Nate unlocked the door and stepped inside. The single main room held an iron stove, a narrow table, 2 mismatched chairs, a wall cabinet, and a shelf with old mason jars full of nails and screws. Nothing luxurious, nothing sentimental, yet nothing random either. Daniel had left the room the way a man leaves a field position, sparse, practical, and arranged with corners in mind. Nate found canned peaches long expired, lantern mantles, 1 sharpened hatchet, and a folded wool blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar. In a lower drawer, he found a framed photograph face down. The glass was cracked, but the faces were clear. Daniel, younger and unsmiling. Nate, at maybe 9, holding a fish with both hands, a shepherd mix at their knees. Nate stared at it longer than he wanted to. Night came down fast. Nate set a battery lantern on the table, checked every window, and rolled out a bedroll near the stove. Cody ate half his food and then stopped, which by itself was enough to tighten Nate's pulse. A working dog on a travel day did not leave meat in a bowl unless something else mattered more. Wind moved through the pines outside. The cabin settled and ticked in ordinary old house ways. An hour passed, then another. Just after midnight, a different sound threaded through the wood and weather. Metal touched metal under the floorboards. Not loud, not clumsy. Controlled. Deliberate. Cody rose in one fluid movement and went still beside the stove. The dog's tail lowered, ears high, shoulders locked. Nate killed the brightest lantern and crouched. The sound came again. A scrape. Then a tiny pause. Then another, directly beneath the kitchen floor. Nate crossed the room without speaking and knelt beside the stove. In the weak sidelight, he saw something he would never have noticed from standing. A seam in the floorboards, too straight, too regular, running under the stove legs and disappearing beneath the cabinet. He set his shoulder against the iron and dragged the stove aside inch by inch. Dust smeared. Metal groaned. Underneath, set flush into the wood, lay an iron ring darkened by age but cleaner than everything around it. He reached toward it, then stopped because Cody had turned away from the floor and toward the front wall. Outside, far below the cabin, an engine cut off. A second later came the soft thump of a vehicle door, then another. Nate lifted the pry bar from beside the stove, hooked the ring, and raised the hidden hatch an inch. Cold mineral air rose from below. The space underneath was not a crawl space. It was depth. He lowered the hatch carefully. A flashlight beam swept once across the front window. Cody gave the low, nearly silent growl Nate had heard only before violence. Somebody had arrived on the ridge at midnight, and somebody had used the hidden door under the stove recently enough to keep the iron ring clean. Nate backed into the shadow beside the wall, one hand on the pry bar, the other resting lightly against Cody's shoulder. He had not unpacked. He had not slept. He had barely crossed the threshold of the inheritance. And already the mountain was telling him the same thing the town had tried to hide in politeness. Daniel Calloway had not left his son an empty cabin. He had left him something men were still willing to come for in the dark. On the drive up, Nate had stopped once at the diner because the rain had thickened, and because old habit told him to take one more look at the locals before going into isolated ground. Inside, 3 men at the counter had lowered their voices when he entered. A waitress in her 50s topped off his coffee without asking and called him sweetheart in the same tone she might have used on a mechanic or a preacher. No one mentioned Daniel directly until Nate paid. Then an old man in a seed company cap said, without looking over, that the Ridgeland had a way of making people hear things. Another man answered that some things under a mountain ought to stay there. Nobody laughed. Nate took the hint for what it was. Not folklore, not drunken talk, but a warning delivered in the only safe shape the room allowed. When he walked back to the truck, Cody was already standing in the passenger seat, staring up the road toward the ridge instead of watching the lot. That had bothered Nate more than the men inside. Cody did not believe in rumors, only in scent, sound, and shifts in pressure. Something on that mountain had reached the dog before it ever reached the house. Nate did not wait for whoever stood outside to decide how the next minute would go. He killed the last lamp, moved with Cody into the dark beside the front wall, and counted sound the way Daniel had once forced him to count breath under stress. 1 man on the porch, 1 to the left of the window, 1 farther back near the deck line, maybe a 4th below the slope, holding the vehicles. The porch boards flexed under careful weight, not the loose confidence of drunks or thieves, but the measured caution of men expecting resistance. Cody's body leaned a fraction forward. Nate took that as the dog's version of the word now. He kicked the front door open with all his weight behind it. The first intruder folded backward across the porch rail. Cody shot past Nate like a released spring and drove the man flat into the mud before the hooded figure understood the fight had started. Gunfire flashed from the side yard. Nate dropped low behind a rain barrel, felt splinters jump from the wall near his ear, and came up with the pry bar in both hands. The shooter rushed too close too soon. Nate broke the man's knee and drove an elbow into the throat before the weapon could level again. Cody still had the first intruder pinned, waiting for command. The 3rd man ran downslope, slipping on wet pine needles as he vanished into the dark. Nate ripped the hood off the pinned intruder and got a quick look. Shaved head, cheap gloves, face he did not recognize. Before he could ask a question, headlights climbed the ridge. Sheriff Wade Rourke arrived alone in his cruiser so fast, Nate felt the truth before he named it. The sheriff had not been called. He had been nearby. Rourke came into the yard with his sidearm drawn, and his expression already arranged into irritated authority. He looked at the injured man, the open door, the moved stove visible inside, and then at Nate. "Did you open anything under that floor?" he asked. "Not are you hurt. Not who was here." Nate heard the shape of the whole county in that one question. He answered no. Rourke relaxed before he hit it. He radioed nothing useful, took no statement worth taking, and called the attackers poachers who must have panicked at the sight of a dome. Nate said poachers did not arrive with radios and coordinated positions. Rourke told him mountain people did all kinds of foolish things at night, and left before Nate could push further. The cruiser taillights disappeared through rain, and Nate knew with absolute certainty that the sheriff had come to assess the secret, not protect a citizen. At first light, Nate reopened the hatch under the stove with a flashlight, a sidearm from the truck lockbox, a climbing line, and Cody pressed close at heel. A ladder descended into a shaft cut too cleanly to be natural. The air smelled of damp stone, oil, and old metal. When Nate reached the bottom, the beam caught faded stencil letters on concrete. Restricted access. federal property. The passage beyond had once been important enough for reinforced walls, cable conduits, and blast doors now half jammed by rust. 20 feet in, Nate found a rack of broken field telephones. 40 feet farther, he found a narrow office with a warped desk, and beside the doorframe, Daniel Calloway's initials scratched into the wood beside a recent chalk mark. Daniel had been there not long ago. Whatever had killed his father had not erased him quickly. Daniel had kept moving underground almost to the end. The tunnel sloped into a relay room full of dead equipment. Behind cracked plexiglass hung an old county map with service routes marked in red. On the desk sat a small waterproof metal box. Nate checked the hinges, then opened it. Inside lay Daniel's old dog tag, a black notebook wrapped in plastic, and a cassette labeled in block letters, "If Nate finds this." Nate opened the notebook first. Daniel's entries were half field log, half angry shorthand, truck plates, dates, drum counts, references to vent shafts, sample chambers, and men he did not trust. One name appeared often enough to feel like a hammer strike. W. Rourke. Sheriff Wade Rourke had not stumbled onto the tunnels recently. He had been tied to them for decades. Cotty stiffened and turned toward the corridor. Nate killed the light. A moment later, a beam slid past the doorway, then a second. Someone else was in the system. Nate waited until the lead man crossed the threshold. Then he hit him hard enough to drive him into the desk. The second attacker came with a knife instead of a gun, which told Nate they wanted silence. Cotty took that man at the elbow and dumped him sideways into a cabinet. Nate stripped a flashlight, disarmed the first intruder, and forced him face down. Before he could question him, a calm voice drifted from the intersection beyond the relay room. "You should have stayed gone, Calloway." A tall man in a dark overcoat stood at the far turn, one hand in a pocket, posture loose, as if this were an inconvenient meeting rather than a violent breach underground. Reed Fallon. Fallon backed away before Nate could close the distance, leaving only the echo of his shoes and a smell of cold cologne. Nate made the correct choice and secured the notebook and cassette instead of chasing him blind into unfamiliar tunnels. When he returned to the two attackers, both had fled through separate corridors while he was moving the evidence. They knew the system better than he did. Back in town, Nate took the cassette to Hank Duvall, a thin repairman in his early 70s who feared Daniel's name more than the broken player. He worked anyway, replacing a belt with fingers that shook just enough to betray memory. Cotty lay under the bench, tense but quiet. When the machine finally turned, the speaker hissed twice and then Daniel's voice filled the cramped shop. It was older, rougher, and more tired than Nate remembered. Daniel said that if Nate was hearing this, then the men in Black Hollow had either failed to kill him when they meant to, or decided that the son might be more useful than the father. Daniel went on to say that the mountain had never been empty, only renamed, resold, and lied about. He said the first tunnel under the cabin was only one throat in a buried system that reached beyond the ridge. He said the local sheriff knew the old maps better than anyone alive. Then the recording cut with a hard pop right after Daniel gave one instruction: trust the dog before you trust the county. That afternoon, Mara Jensen found Nate outside the repair shop because she had seen the sheriff's cruiser circling the square and guessed trouble was moving faster than paperwork. She brought parcel maps, aerial survey copies, and one detail nobody else had volunteered. Years earlier, a mineral survey application touching Daniel's land had vanished before review. Spread across Nate's truck hood, the maps showed a blocked maintenance spur running from his ridge to a dry ravine east of the cabin. Mara believed the spur serviced a vent and said Daniel had saved her brother's life in winter. They reached the ravine near dusk. Cody found the hidden grate under briars and leaves packed too neatly against rusted metal. Nate cleared the brush and saw fresh tool marks near the lock. Somebody had serviced the vent recently. Using one of Hank's old keys, he opened the hatch. The chamber below was smaller than the relay room, but stranger. Part utility annex and part geology lab. Metal shelves held boxed sample cores, unlabeled mineral trays, and survey binders stamped with faded federal seals. On one wall hung a map showing rare earth veins running under the Callaway acreage and into parcels recently purchased by companies Mara recognized as Reed Fallon shells. Greed had a new shape now. This was no longer only about secrecy, it was about buried value. Then Cody went rigid at a steel locker near the back wall. Inside, Nate found a cracked hard hat, one dried bloodstain on canvas, and a spiral notebook belonging to a former Army engineer named Louis Greer. Greer wrote about a bricked-off chamber deeper in the annex, about a false wall, and about seeing newer bodies after an old collapse exposed a sealed room. Before Nate could finish the page, truck engines ground to a stop above the ravine. Voices descended through the shaft. Reed Fallon was there in person, irritated rather than alarmed, and Sheriff Rourke answered him from near the entrance. Nate heard Fallon say he wanted Callaway alive until the false wall was opened. That changed everything. Nate was not simply a witness to remove. He was a key they believed Daniel had hidden. Back at the cabin, Nate and Mara searched every wall, joist and crawl of the place while rain hit the windows. Daniel always hid things in layers. Cody searched the room with steady focus. Near midnight, Nate climbed onto the stone base of the chimney and found a waxed packet tucked behind loose mortar. Inside was a note in Daniel's blocky handwriting. It held only one line. "The truth is behind the wall with the broken star." Mara read it twice and asked if Daniel ever wrote plainly. Nate said plainness had not been one of his father's talents. At first light, they searched the rock below the rear deck and found an old survey marker carved into limestone, one 5-point star split by a crack. Behind it, hidden by moss and runoff stain, ran a seam too straight to be natural. Nate used a mason's hammer from Daniel's shed and knocked through enough stone to expose a narrow cavity. Inside sat duplicate keys, folded maps, a grease-wrapped cassette recorder, and a second note. This one directed Nate to check Daniel's crash file against the dispatch log and said that if the times did not match, he should assume every official word about the wreck had been prepared before the truck left the road. That level of anticipation was frightening. Daniel had not simply feared being killed. He had predicted the paperwork that would tidy his death afterward. They drove to the county library because the courthouse systems were too exposed and because old microfilm still had the virtue of existing outside easy revision. Mara unlocked the archive room with a back key, rolled Daniel's newspaper dates onto the reader, and built the timeline from dispatch blurbs, public notices, and fax headers attached to the sheriff's report copies. The official crash supposedly happened at 2:14 a.m., yet the preliminary incident form had been sent at 1:51 a.m., 23 minutes before the wreck. Nate stared at the numbers while something old and ugly settled into certainty. Daniel had not died in a confused accident. Somebody had chosen the story in advance and waited only to attach his body to it. Mara printed every frame, made backup copies, and hid one strip inside a county plat tube before they left. It proved a habit that would save them later. Reed Fallon intercepted them on the sidewalk outside the library. He did not bring muscle. He brought polish. He told Nate that Daniel had become unstable in his final years, that the county was trying to move forward, and that the Ridge property sat above land with transformational value for the entire region. He described data storage, mineral extraction, private capital, and jobs. Nate listened long enough to understand that Fallon was not merely benefiting from old corruption. He intended to modernize it. When Nate told him to get out of the way, Fallon lowered his voice and said men who fought the future usually got buried by it. Cody did not bark. The dog simply fixed Fallon with a stare so cold that even Fallon's easy posture changed before he stepped aside. The next attempt came before noon on Miller Gap Road. Nate felt it first as a softness in the brake pedal, then as a full dead drop under his boot while the truck started downhill toward a ravine turn. He downshifted, fought the wheel, and threw the truck into a drainage ditch rather than over the edge. Mara hit the dash. Cody braced but stayed controlled, claws digging into the rubber mat. When Nate crawled under the frame, he found the rear brake lines sliced cleanly. No debris tear. No rust failure. Someone had touched the truck while it sat in town. Mara wanted to leave Black Hollow immediately and hand everything to an honest investigator. Nate almost agreed. Then the clinic called and said Hank Duval had vanished from observation after a family transfer signed by 2 deputies. Hank was now either a liability the sheriff wanted controlled or a witness the sheriff wanted dead. That night, Nate and Mara went back below the cabin because the tunnel system remained the only place Daniel had trusted more than surface law. Cody led them deeper than before into a lower annex where military concrete gave way to older quarry reinforcement. The walls sweated mineral water. Chemical residue leaked from blank-faced drums stacked in side chambers. The contamination Daniel had mentioned was real enough to poison the creeks. Then the passage opened into a grated shaft over black groundwater with an oily skin. Mara looked down and whispered that Fallon's development fantasy was built over a slow-moving environmental crime scene. Nate said that made the county more dangerous, not less. Men protecting money would lie. Men protecting both money and prison time would kill. Cody solved the next problem before either human recognized it. At a wall of stacked crates stamped defense disposal, the dog stopped at one narrow gap, inhaled once, and pressed forward against a draft. Nate and Mara shifted the crates aside and revealed a hidden service door with a wheel handle missing one spoke. The broken star. Inside lay a record vault insulated against moisture. Ledgers, payroll envelopes, survey plates, cassette duplicates, and a dented lockbox set on steel shelving. Nate opened the nearest ledger and found dates spanning 3 decades, names of deputies, contractors, shell buyers, trucking firms, and county officials. Reed Fallon's companies appeared only in later years, but the pipeline beneath the mountain was much older. Then Nate turned a page and found Daniel's name beside the word non-compliant, followed by a voided payment authorization and a handwritten line in Wade Rourke's block print. Take the boy out of county first. Nate's throat closed. He had not been sent away to school because Daniel was ashamed of him or tired of him. Daniel had exiled his own son because local men had already discussed removing the entire bloodline. Suppressor fire shredded the shelf above Nate's head before he could say any of it aloud. Fallon's contractors had found them. Cody hit Nate low and shoved him off the first line of fire a split second before more rounds chewed the paper-stuffed air where his chest had been. Mara dropped behind a steel cabinet and started filling a dry bag with ledgers and tapes, while Nate returned controlled fire toward the doorway. The gunmen stayed in motion and rushed in overconfidently. One fell, another retreated just long enough to toss a canister across the floor. Gas hissed out in a pale white stream, enough to blind and choke in a sealed room. Nate tied a rag over Mara's mouth, clipped the evidence bag to his harness, and followed Cody into a maintenance crawl Daniel or Greer had once marked for drainage. The space narrowed to stone and black water. Mara nearly slipped twice. Nate shoved the bag ahead with one arm and kept the other on Cotty's flank whenever the dog paused to make sure the humans were still behind him. They crawled out through an old quarry opening into night air, just as a glow bloomed above the trees on the ridge. Nate looked up and saw orange moving where there should have been only dark. Fallon's people had chosen a second solution. The cabin was burning. He sprinted uphill with Cotty beside him and Mara gasping behind. By the time they reached the yard, fire had blown through the front window and begun licking the porch roof. Nate cut the propane line before the tank could flash. He dragged the hidden caches he could reach through the smoke and kicked burning boards off the steps, while Cotty held the yard with teeth bared at every tree shadow. Mara ran downslope until she found signal and called the volunteer station. The stone chimney and part of the wall survived, but the place Daniel had spent years defending was half charred by dawn. When the flames died enough to leave the ash readable, Nate found one print near the side wall where the mud met soot. Sheriff issue tread. Size and pattern matched the boots Rourke wore every day in town. The sheriff had either stood in the yard during the fire or sent one of his own men there. Mara said they now had proof of arson, attempted murder, evidence suppression, and falsified records. Nate said proof only mattered if somebody beyond Black Hollow lived long enough to see it. Before either could decide the next move, Mara's phone buzzed with one voicemail captured. It was Hank Duval, saying 7 words before the line cut out. Coal chute below the church. That was not enough information for comfort. It was enough for direction. Nate looked once at the burned cabin, once at the woods below the ridge, and knew the fight had moved beyond property. They were now hunting a witness while being hunted by a county desperate to close every mouth. Black Hollow woke to smoke over the ridge before breakfast. By 8 o'clock, the sheriff's office was already calling the cabin fire an accident caused by unsafe lantern use. By 10, a deputy at the diner was telling people Nate Calloway had come home unstable and armed. Rourke understood narrative as well as force, and the county still believed it could outrun evidence if it moved quickly enough. Mara arrived at the burned ridge with blood on one sleeve and anger bright in her face. Someone had broken into the library archive room after dawn, smashed the microfilm reader, and taken every printed copy of Daniel's crash timeline. The single strip Mara had hidden in the Platt tube was now the only surviving library copy. She handed it to Nate like it was a bar of gold. Then she played Hank Duval's voicemail again. Coal chute below the church. The old Baptist church sat on a wooded rise west of town. Nate left the truck a quarter-mile away and approached through wet cedar with Mara behind him and Cotty ranging out just far enough to scout and return. The dog found Hank's scent first, nose driving him toward a brush-covered basement hatch near the foundation. Nate snapped the lock with a tire iron and opened into a narrow boiler room that smelled of mildew, ash, and trapped fear. Hank Duval was tied to a pipe with electrical cord, face bruised, one eye half closed, but alive. A deputy lay unconscious beside a coal shovel and a spilled lantern. Nate cut him free while Mara checked for fractures. Hank said Rourke's people had dragged him from the clinic because they believed Daniel told him where the North Face room was. Hank had denied everything until he realized denial only bought him a slower death. Then he left the voicemail and waited for luck. He had more than luck to offer. Years earlier, when he still did repair work for county contractors, Hank had helped fit hinges and vent panels inside a buried bunker on the mountain's north side. Daniel later found that bunker while tracing truck manifests tied to late-night quarry runs. Daniel believed the North Face held the master archive, the original reports, the oldest receipts, and maybe the evidence that connected local corruption to vanished federal men. Hank also said something Nate had wanted and feared in equal measure. Daniel had come to him the night before the so-called accident bleeding from the ribs and certain he was being watched. Daniel said if he died, Wade Rourke would be the reason. It was not proof in the legal sense yet. It was witness memory. Sometimes that was where justice began. Sirens rose from the road below the church before they could move Hank more than 10 feet. Nate killed the lantern and got them into motion. 2 deputies entered from the basement side while another circled above toward the graveyard. This was no welfare check. It was a finishing crew. Nate tackled the first deputy into a stack of hymnals, stripped the radio, and drove the man face first into the wall. Cotty slammed the second deputy at the knees before the man cleared his holster. Mara snatched the fallen radio, and over its hiss came Sheriff Rourke's voice ordering every unit not to bring Calloway in unless he was dead or cuffed. Hank heard it. Mara heard it. Whatever room remained for doubt in Black Hollow shrank to almost nothing. They escaped through the church cemetery and down a steep path into a creek cut where limestone shelves gave them cover from the road. There, under dripping stone and roots, Nate finally opened the last sealed envelope recovered from the cabin wall. Inside was a Polaroid of Daniel standing beside a younger Wade Rourke and an unidentified federal supervisor in front of a steel door painted with the number 12. On the back, Daniel had written, "Before I knew what they stored under us." Hank recognized the door immediately. Bunker 12 sat beneath the North Face Hall Road, concealed behind collapsed conveyor framing from an old quarry operation. If the church basement had been a holding place, the bunker would be the vault. They reached the Hall Road after midnight. The entrance sat where Hank said it would, hidden behind cane and rusted conveyor arms. The steel door opened into a preserved pocket of history the rest of the mountain had tried and failed to swallow. Communication racks lined the first room. The second held locked file cabinets and tagged supply crates. The third room stopped Nate cold. On a steel table beneath a tarp lay Daniel Calloway's final field pack, cut open and marked with evidence tape that had never been filed. Beside it sat a reel-to-reel recorder with Daniel's voice still threaded on the machine. Daniel's voice came out hoarse, strained and close, as if the microphone had been on the same table where he bled. Daniel said the bunker linked the tunnel network to off-book disposal traffic after the federal relay station shut down. He said contractors used the mountain to bury chemicals, move undeclared military stock, and hide land surveys showing rare earth value beneath the Calloway acreage and adjoining parcels. He said Wade Rourke had once tried to walk away when he was younger, but power and money taught him to stay. Then Daniel said the sentence Nate had not been ready to hear, no matter how long he had expected it. "I wasn't drunk, son. Wade put me in that truck after Fallon's men worked me over in this room, because I would not tell them where I moved the master ledger." Mara pressed both hands over her mouth. Hank stared at the concrete. Nate kept his eyes on the spinning reel until it stopped, because looking away might have made the truth less fixed. Then he searched every console in the room until he found a false battery housing beneath the communications board. Inside was the ledger Daniel had died protecting. It was thicker than the copies in the record vault and indexed with brutal precision. Burial sites, shipment codes, payment chains, deputy names, survey coordinates, shell property transfers, and references to 2 federal contractors listed as reassigned after dates that now looked a lot like death. This was not a county scandal. It was a map of organized silence built over years. Trip flares ignited outside before they finished photographing the first pages. Fallon's people had ringed the bunker. Rourke's units blocked the Hall Road. Nate read the geometry fast and chose vertical escape over horizontal death. The bunker's antenna shaft still climbed to the north ridge through rusted iron rungs. He clipped the dry bag to his harness, slung Daniel's field pack across one shoulder, and sent Mara upward behind him after Hank. Cody waited until Nate gave the release signal, then climbed the service ladder with impossible focus, wounded by nothing yet, driven by everything. Below them, Sheriff Rourke used a bullhorn to offer safe surrender in the false, patient tone of a man who thought exhaustion would do what bullets had not. Nate answered by tossing photocopied pages from the ledger down into the quarry wind. The papers scattered over deputies, contractors, and trucks like white birds breaking formation. The chase across the North Ridge lasted 3 cold, breathless hours. Mara drove Hank's old farm truck without headlights once they reached the logging cut. Nate and Cody jumped into the bed under live fire. The truck held, the ridge fell behind them, and by dawn they were hidden in a hunting blind above Hollow Creek, with the master ledger, Daniel's pack, and one hard truth none of them could unhear. Daniel had not died because he was reckless, lonely, or drunk, as Black Hollow preferred to say. He died because he chose not to hand the mountain back to the men already poisoning it. Nate searched Daniel's field pack while the first gray light filtered through cedar slats. He found spare batteries, handwritten survey notes, 2 old cash envelopes, and a business card tucked inside the map case. Dana Mercer, Kentucky Office of Inspector General. On the back, Daniel had written 5 words. She didn't sell out. That changed the next move. Mara wanted to call immediately. Hank wanted to run. Nate wanted chain of custody, outside jurisdiction, and just enough daylight left in the county to make sure the evidence survived the asking. He used a burner phone from Daniel's pack and called the number. Dana answered on the second ring. Nate gave only names: Bunker 12, Rourke, Fallon, and Master Ledger. Dana did not waste time with disbelief. She asked one question instead. Is the dog still alive? Nate glanced at Cody, who sat at the blind opening staring toward the valley and listening for movement. Nate said yes. Dana told him to stay alive until dark and to trust no badge wearing Black Hollow dirt. Dana Mercer arrived in Black Hollow after dark in a mud-splattered pickup with temporary plates and a retired state trooper named Ellis Boone riding shotgun. She looked like a field investigator, which reassured Nate. There was no polished disbelief in her face when he handed over the ledger pages, the Polaroid, the microfilm strip, Daniel's tapes, and Hank Duvall's recorded statement. Dana reviewed everything in a hunting blind lit by one shaded lantern, while Cody lay at Nate's boot with the stillness of a second armed witness. By the time she finished, her expression had hardened from professional focus into personal contempt. She said they had enough for an emergency state intervention if they could secure the original bunker, the lower record vault, and one living confession that tied Wade Rourke to Daniel's murder. If they moved too early, Rourke would burn what remained underground and claim the rest was veteran fantasy. If they moved too late, Fallon might clear the tunnels before sunrise. Timing would be the difference between scandal and prosecution. Black Hollow's annual Founders' Night gave them the window. Every October, the town gathered in the square for a bonfire, cider, church music, and enough nostalgia to make the county feel harmless for a few hours. Dana proposed using the celebration as a screen. She and Ellis would quietly seize the courthouse communications room and block or record every sheriff's transmission. Nate, Mara, and Cody would re-enter through the ravine vent, recover the remaining original records from the lower system, and force movement underground before Fallon could move assets. Hank wanted no part of another tunnel, and said so. Dana told him his job was to stay breathing in a safe house and keep repeating the truth to a recorder until dawn. Nate respected that answer. Courage had different uniforms. The square looked almost beautiful from a distance. Children ran between parked trucks carrying paper cups of cider. Church volunteers hung strings of yellow bulbs over folding tables. A local band played near the courthouse steps while Sheriff Rourke, in a clean jacket and campaign smile, shook hands like a man certain he still owned the weather. Reed Fallon stood nearby in dark wool, already absorbing local trust he had not earned. Nate watched from a ridge above town with Cotty pressed close and felt the deep American weirdness of it. Below them sat food, music, and family photos under decorative light. Under the mountain behind them waited burial sites, poisoned water, and a dead man's voice threaded on tape. Counties like Black Hollow did not survive by being simple. They survived by teaching ordinary people how to stand on top of terrible things without looking down. Donna and Ellis moved first. Mara monitored the borrowed sheriff frequency from a parked utility truck outside town limits. Nate and Cotty slipped into the ravine entrance under cover of the bonfire speeches. The vent chamber and geology annex were empty. Fallon had already started pulling material. Empty trays lay on the floor. Cabinets had been opened and stripped. Fresh boot marks led deeper toward the lower relay rooms. Nate moved fast, light low, Cotty sweeping ahead. The fight started in the third junction, where Fallon's contractors had set an angled kill box using work lights, stacked crates, and overlapping lines of fire. The first burst hit the wall inches from Nate's face. Cotty slammed into him, knocking him behind a concrete support before the second burst arrived. Nate returned fire only long enough to create movement, then changed levels and angles the way old training still lived in bone. The men waiting in the junction were better than county deputies and more disciplined, but the mountain did not belong to them yet. Cotty kept forcing them off their timing, appearing and vanishing at the edges of the dark, with enough speed to break sight pictures and patience. Mara reached Nate at the second support line carrying extra magazines taken from a dead contractor near the vent shaft. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady. She fed him ammo, counted movement from the flank, and then did something Nate would remember forever. When one of Fallon's men rolled a lit flare toward a leaking fuel cache, Mara kicked a metal tray over the spill path, while Cotty lunged and dragged the flare sideways by the cloth tail. The fire did not catch. That saved everyone in the chamber. They pushed deeper and reached the record vault just ahead of Reed Fallon himself. Fallon had abandoned his overcoat. He still looked expensive, but no longer composed. He demanded the ledger copy, called Black Hollow a useless county full of frightened people, and said Daniel Calloway had thrown away a fortune over sentimental contamination. Nate asked who had killed Daniel. Fallon answered with the truth a narcissist usually could not resist. "Not me," he said. "I bought the years after." Rourke handled the old man. It was not a courtroom statement, but it was the first time Fallon placed Wade Rourke directly where the murder lived. Rourke entered through the side passage carrying a shotgun, face raw with the exhaustion of a man who had run out of layered lies. He did not try charm. He said Daniel had forced his hand. He said counties died when outside regulators got involved. He said Fallon was garbage, but useful garbage, and that men like Nate always misunderstood what it took to keep a place alive. Nate heard the oldest American corruption in that speech. Steal from the people, poison the land, bury the witnesses, and call it local protection. Before Rourke could fire, Donna Mercer's voice boomed through the public address line overhead. She had seized the courthouse board and patched the tunnel system into a live recording chain going straight to state servers. Every word underground was now preserved beyond county reach. Rourke looked up at the speaker as if the mountain itself had betrayed him. He fired anyway. The blast tore concrete from the doorway and knocked Ellis Boone backward when the trooper charged in from the passage behind him. Nate crossed the distance before Rourke could rack the shotgun again. They hit the floor hard among ledgers, metal shelves, and broken work lights. Rourke was older, but he still fought like a man used to winning ugly. He bit, gouged, and went for weapons instead of leverage. Nate answered with the colder discipline deployment had left in him. When the shotgun skidded away, Rourke reached for a knife in his boot. Nate trapped the wrist, broke the grip, and hammered the older man into the concrete until the knife came free. A second later, Fallon tried to bolt through the far side of the vault, but Cotty cut him off with a low, murderous warning that stopped him cleaner than any bullet would have. For a suspended second, the whole room held. Fallon pinned by a dog, Rourke on his back under Nate's forearm, Dana's voice still speaking into the recording system, and Mara stuffing original payroll envelopes into an evidence bag with blood on one sleeve and tunnel dust across her face. State tactical units hit the road minutes later. Their arrival should have ended the underground fight, but endings in Black Hollow never arrived politely. While Ellis Boone cuffed Rourke and Dana directed units toward the bunker routes, Cotty turned his head toward the wall beyond the vault and growled low. Nate followed the line of the dog's attention. The floor sloped wrong beneath mineral runoff. The wall looked solid until you noticed the draft moving through one narrow crack. Daniel had hidden one more room beyond the record vault, just as Greer's notes suggested. Nate knelt beside the seam while officers secured Fallon. Rourke, bleeding from the mouth, laughed through split lips and said the mountain would bury that last room before any court ever saw it. Nate almost believed him, because the whole county had taught him how powerful a buried thing could be. Then the first tremor rolled through the floor. One of Fallon's contractors, cornered deeper in the North Branch, had tried to escape past an old demolition line and set off a charge no one alive had installed. Dust dropped from the ceiling. Cotty snapped around. Dana shouted to move. Nate, Mara, Dana, Ellis, 2 state officers, Fallon and Rourke all had impossible choice in the same second. Run for daylight now or force the final chamber before the mountain sealed it forever. Nate looked at the crack in the wall, then at Rourke, who suddenly stopped smiling. That was answer enough. Whatever lay beyond that seam mattered more than the sheriff's fear could hide. Nate grabbed a pry bar, set his shoulder to the stone, and told Cotty to stay with him. The dog planted beside the wall, ears high, body pointed toward the draft, as the mountain shook again and the last secret of Black Hollow waited inches beyond reach. The wall gave on the third strike. Stone dust burst outward, followed by a gust of trapped air so cold and mineral-heavy it smelled older than the rest of the tunnel system. Nate widened the seam with the pry bar while Cotty pressed forward, trembling not with fear but with working drive. Beyond the split stone lay a chamber that was neither natural cave nor standard military room. It had started as limestone, then been squared by engineers, shelved by clerks, and hidden by men who expected their secrets to outlive memory. Rusting tables stood beneath dead bulbs. Metal shelving held sealed drums, film canisters, archive boxes, payroll binders, survey maps, and tagged evidence tins. Against the far wall, half covered by lime and collapsed canvas, lay the shapes of 2 shallow graves. Mara turned away and swallowed hard. Dana swore once, quietly, into the radio and ordered homicide, environmental response, and the Attorney General's office to the mountain at first light. Nate moved deeper because Daniel had died for this room, and because truth, once reached, demanded witness. The master index sat in a locked drawer under the central table. Nate forced it open and found the document that bound the entire mountain together. Every burial site, every shell company, every off-book shipment, every payoff code, every reassignment used to erase dead federal contractors from the paper trail. The index also contained land studies proving Fallon's investors had known for years that rare earth deposits ran under Callaway acreage and adjoining parcels they intended to consolidate after Daniel's death. Greed, not merely grown in Black Hollow, it had been planned with engineering precision. Donna photographed pages while Mara stacked labeled binders into evidence cases. Ellis Boone guarded the doorway, with one arm hanging awkwardly from the shotgun blast he had taken minutes earlier. Sheriff Wade Rourke, cuffed and seated against the wall, watched everything with the exhausted hatred of a man forced to witness his own burial in paperwork. Then the contractor's explosion reached them. The first blast shook dust from the ceiling. The second punched hard enough to kill the lights and send a crack racing across the archive wall. The mountain answered in a language no siren could overpower. Stones snapped. Shelves pitched. One grave tarp slid aside, exposing human bone beneath lime. Dana ordered immediate evacuation. Nate grabbed the master index case, shoved Mara toward the exit, and turned for Cotty. The dog was gone. For one savage second, Nate thought falling rock had taken him. Then he saw movement behind the last row of shelves. Cotty vanished into a narrow slot between stone and steel, reappeared with a leather wallet in his mouth, and sprinted back through the dust. Daniel's wallet. It must have been kicked into the gap during the last struggle years earlier. Nate snatched it from the dog, clipped the index case to his harness, and ran. The escape became a race through collapsing dark. Ellis and two state officers hauled Rourke toward the outer passage because live defendants mattered. Fallon, who had been restrained at the vault entrance, twisted free during the smoke and sprinted for the north branch. One contractor still on his feet followed him with a pistol and panic in equal measure. Nate should have stayed with the evidence. Instead, he saw Cotty wheel toward the same branch and knew the dog had already made the choice. If Fallon escaped into open country with even a sliver of leverage left, the fight would bleed outward for months. Nate followed. The passage opened onto the old quarry lip where moonlight cut through dust like dirty silver. Fallon reached the edge first and turned with all the arrogance stripped out of him. He offered Nate money, then partnership, then immunity arranged through people far above county level. When none of that landed, he said Daniel had begged before the end. Nate hit him hard enough to break the sentence and send both men staggering across broken shale. The surviving contractor drew his pistol. Cotty took the gun arm before the shot settled and drove the man sideways into a support post. The bullet blew limestone chips into the air. Then the ledge under Fallon's boots cracked. Everything narrowed into a single second. Nate could let gravity finish what law had begun, or he could drag a guilty man back into the world to answer properly. Daniel had not died to teach his son vengeance. He had died trying to leave him a choice. Nate lunged, caught Fallon's coat, and hauled him onto stable rock, just as the outer lip gave way into the quarry void. Fallon collapsed coughing, shocked less by rescue than by the fact that the man he had hunted still believed in consequence over revenge. Cotty released the contractor only when Nate gave the command, then reset beside Fallon with a low warning that made further courage unlikely. Behind them, the north branch collapsed in a roaring wall of stone and dust. That sealed half the system forever. It also ended the chance of anyone else running out through the old quarry lines. State tactical lights were already cutting through the trees below when Nate dragged Fallon back toward the main chamber junction. Deputies who had obeyed Rourke's orders without understanding the full scope of the crime now stood stunned in the wash of blue-red emergency light, while outside agencies took control of the mountain road. Wade Rourke was strapped to a gurney and cuffs, still insisting he had done ugly things for the sake of the county. Dana Mercer answered by reading Daniel's final tape log into the official incident recorder, where every medic, trooper, and deputy could hear the dead man name his killer. Reed Fallon went out under armed escort, shirt torn, face bruised, pride shattered, still threatening investors, lawsuits, and senators. No one in Black Hollow had ever seen in person. Dawn turned the ridge from nightmare to evidence. Forensic teams entered through the north face bunker, then the ravine vent, then the stove hatch under what remained of the cabin. Environmental crews flagged contaminated zones with bright tape across creek lines and drainage cuts. Reporters began gathering by the square before noon. By evening, Black Hollow sat on every regional news cycle from Lexington to Nashville as helicopters mapped the ridge from above. The town that had lived under practiced silence for decades now had microphones shoved into every diner and gas station, asking when people first suspected Sheriff Wade Rourke was dirty. Most said they never knew. Some said they had always known, but not in a way that sounded useful. Nate understood the difference. A secret can survive a long time when ordinary people learn to confuse fear with normal life. Only when the first wave of state control settled did Nate open the wallet Cotty had saved. Inside were Daniel's old driver's license, 2 folded 20s, a hardware receipt, and one photograph Nate had never seen before. He was maybe 8 in it, asleep against a truck door with his boots muddy and one hand still curled around a toy plane. Daniel sat beside him in profile, not looking at the camera, one rough hand resting awkwardly over his son's shoulder, as if love had always reached him through action before language. Tucked behind the photo was a note worn soft at the folds. It said, "I could not make the county clean, but I could keep you alive long enough to choose what kind of man you would be." Nate read it twice and then handed it to Mara because grief had finally arrived in a shape he could not outrun with motion. They buried part of Daniel's ashes 3 days later after the state exhumation confirmed the staged injuries and released what could be identified. Nate chose a young pine above the ravine where wind moved cleanly and the creek could still be heard under stone. Mara stood beside him. Hank removed his cap. Dana stayed back to give them distance. Cotty sat at Nate's left knee throughout the burial, bandage gone now, one new scar settling into the shoulder where Black Hollow had failed to break him. Nate did not give a speech. He said only that Daniel should have had more peace than the county allowed him, and that the mountain would speak now whether men liked it or not. When the last handful of earth hit the roots, the valley below looked smaller than it once had, not because the land had changed, but because the lie governing it finally had. That evening, Nate stood beside the burned stone shell of the cabin, while searchlights still crossed the ridge behind him. Cotty leaned lightly against his leg and watched the tree line with calm, disciplined focus. The fight for survival was over. The fight for truth had finally moved into daylight, where signatures, testimony, and witnesses could finish what the mountain had begun. For good now. The state moved fast once Black Hollow stopped controlling its own story. Within 48 hours, Wade Rourke was under homicide investigation. Reed Fallon's shell companies were frozen. The North Face bunker was sealed as a joint evidence scene, and environmental teams were sampling creek beds all through the valley. Men who had once walked the square with the lazy confidence of local permanents suddenly found themselves staring into cameras or answering questions under caution. Some claimed ignorance. Some claimed they were only following orders. Some discovered religion with remarkable speed. Nate stayed on the ridge through all of it because leaving before the first layer of truth settled felt too much like abandoning Daniel a second time. The old cabin, or what fire had spared of it, stood as a blackened stone shell above the drop. State tape fluttered around the stove hatch. Survey stakes lined the yard. Cotty moved through the scene with the precise calm of a dog who understood that danger had changed shape but not vanished. Dana Mercer came up the mountain every day for a week, sometimes in field clothes, sometimes in the same wrinkled blazer she wore to court briefings in Frankfurt. She walked Nate through chain of custody details, deposition timing, and the difference between what he knew emotionally and what the state needed factually. It was less comforting than honesty, but more useful than pity. She also told him something no official press conference would say. Daniel Calloway had probably been one stubborn act away from breaking the whole structure years earlier. He failed only because he ran out of living allies before his enemies ran out of reach. Nate took that in silence. There was relief inside it, but also pain. Daniel had not abandoned the fight. He had simply been left to carry it too long. Mara became part of the Ridge almost without announcing it. She brought food, archival copies, clean socks, and practical conversations. Hank Duvall brought tools he pretended Nate would misuse without supervision. Ellis Boone came once with his arm in a sling and dropped off extra range lights, saying only that he preferred his retirement quieter than this. The county below shifted in slow, visible ways. Parents who once told their children not to ask about the Calloway Ridge now drove past it with windows down. The diner started hanging newspapers on a corkboard near the register, and every new headline brought people in earlier. Church members organized meals for families tied to the cleanup crews. A few men who had worked trucking routes for Rourke asked for lawyers. Others vanished long enough to prove their own guilt. Nate watched all of it with the uneasy understanding that justice never looked as clean from close range as people wished from far away. Real justice arrived with paperwork, excavation permits, bruised witnesses, contaminated soil reports, and funerals delayed by evidence law. It was slower than revenge and harder to trust. Daniel had still wanted it. When the state finally released a portion of Daniel's remains for burial, Nate chose the young pine above the ravine because it overlooked both water and stone. The small service drew more people than he expected. Mara stood close enough to catch him if his knees failed, though they did not. Hank removed his cap and cried openly without shame. Dana stayed near the back with Ellis, guarding privacy in the practical way officials sometimes do when they remember they are human first. Even two men from the diner came, both of them carrying coffee in paper cups and not speaking until after the dirt was settled. Nate said very little. He thanked Daniel for trying. He apologized for taking so long to understand why his father had pushed him away. Then he laid the old wallet under the roots in a sealed tin, not as evidence anymore, but as a final act of return. Cotty sat through the whole burial without shifting once, eyes on the tree line, posture aligned with Nate's body as naturally as breath. After the burial came the harder question: what to do with the ridge? Lawyers told Nate he could sell and walk away with a clean title once seizure disputes were finished. Environmental agents warned that parts of the underground system would remain closed for years, maybe forever. Mara said selling would make sense. Hank said selling would make him an idiot. Dana said neither choice would change what Daniel had died to protect: the right of the place to stop being used by men like Rourke and Fallon. Nate spent 3 nights sleeping in a tent beside the stone shell before he understood his own answer. He did not want the old cabin back exactly. Too much of its life had been defense. He wanted a house that faced daylight instead of secrecy. So he filed permits, cleared salvageable stone, and began rebuilding. The work started with beams and measurements, which suited him. Grief was easier to handle when it had tools. Hank argued over every cut and secretly loved having somebody worth arguing with. Mara drafted simple plans for a wider porch, bigger windows, stronger floor joists, and no hidden hatch in the kitchen. That last choice mattered more than either of them said out loud. New house would not be built over concealed access to the underworld. It would stand above sealed ground and open sky. Nate saved the old stove door and one unburned corner post from the original cabin. He kept Daniel's photograph on a sawhorse shelf where he could see it while he worked. Some mornings, the mountain felt quiet enough to be new. Other mornings, helicopters still crossed overhead toward the bunker site, and the old fight came back in rotor wash and diesel smell. Cody adapted to both realities. He patrolled the work perimeter by habit, learned the schedules of forensic teams and carpenters, and eventually relaxed enough to sleep in the shade of the new porch frame with one ear still cocked toward the trees. Black Hollow's public face kept changing. Wade Rourke was denied bail after the staged crash evidence, tunnel recordings, and Hank's testimony aligned. Reed Fallon's attorneys tried to detach him from the murder and tie everything to local corruption, but the ledgers, property records, and recorded statements made that strategy look thinner each week. State environmental reports confirmed chemical burial and groundwater risk across multiple drainage lines, which turned the case from local scandal into a broader state failure. Reporters loved the grand angles: corrupt sheriff, hidden tunnels, Navy SEAL son, loyal dog. But Nate learned to avoid their appetite for simplification. The story was not that a hero had arrived and fixed a wicked town. The story was that one dead man had protected enough truth for his son to finish carrying it. Daniel had been the hinge. Nate was only the last hand on the door. By late spring, the new house had shape. The porch faced the valley. Wide windows caught morning light across the pines. The walls were thicker, the roof stronger, the lines simpler. Mara brought coffee up before sunrise on the day they hung the front door. Hank complained the hinges were too modern and then adjusted them perfectly himself. Dana visited once in plain clothes, stood on the porch without saying much, and finally admitted Daniel would have hated the attention and loved the result. Nate believed her. He placed the cracked family photograph inside on a clean shelf near the entry, not to sanctify the past, but to stop running from it. Outside, the pine over Daniel's grave held its new needles against the wind. One evening, after the last light had turned the valley gold, Nate sat on the porch step and rested a hand against Cody's neck. The dog's healed shoulder scar caught the warm edge of sunset. Below them, Black Hollow looked smaller and more honest than it once had. Not better in every way. Towns did not become pure because one lie collapsed. But the old machinery of fear was broken, and people had begun speaking in full sentences where whispers used to live. Mara came up the porch carrying 2 mugs and did not ask whether Nate planned to stay through winter, because by then both of them knew the answer. He had inherited a cabin meant to be a trap, a tunnel meant to swallow truth, and a county trained to protect the wrong men. What he was building now was none of those things. It was a home above buried darkness, a place where morning could enter without permission, and where a son and a dog, who had both been sent into danger, could finally face the same horizon without waiting for footsteps in the floor. The porch lantern came on at dusk, steady and unafraid, and for the first time since Nate crossed the county line, silence on the ridge felt like peace instead of warning. At last. Sometimes the miracle is not that danger disappears, but that God gives courage, timing, and the right companion to walk through it. In ordinary life, many battles stay buried under the surface just like that mountain. Yet truth still matters. Loyalty still matters. and one faithful heart can still lead another into light. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to K9 and Seal Stories. May God bless every person watching tonight. Protect every family carrying silent pain. Strengthen those who feel alone. And lead every weary soul toward peace, mercy, healing, and lasting hope.